delay. So welcome to this afternoon's session on establishing institutions of public integrity. This session is done under the auspices of one of the Blavatnik School's research and practitioner programs called the Building Integrity Program. And if you're more interested in our work, you can have a look at our webpage within the Blavatnik School of Government website. So I'm absolutely delighted here to have four fantastic guests. We have Ben Gummer, we have Karen Weaver, we have Nika Gilauri, and we have Andrew Goodman. But before I turn to our guests, I just wanted to start by asking you a couple of sort of survey questions. So we're talking about integrity. So I thought, first of all, who in this room thinks that would trust a politician when it comes to the crunch to prioritise the public interest over their own personal gain? Hands up. So Ben, one politician definitely not, but one politician definitely over here. Who then trusts? Who will generally trust the institutions, the public institutions, the public servants with whom then politicians work? Then when sort of situations like this arise, to push back and try to seek to not become complicit with any kind of corruption on behalf of politicians. Who thinks the institutions in their countries are able to push back, would be confident pushing back? Bit more. And finally, as a question, who would trust companies that when opportunities for corruption to be engaged in self-dealing within your own country are offered by politicians or public institutions, not to take up that opportunity and to engage, to be the other side of the coin? Who would trust companies not to be complicit in such corruption? Condition. Great. So I think today's room is a relatively accurate sample of a lot of the trust data that we get today, particularly coming out of institutions like the Goodman Trust Barometer. Very low trust in all three parts of our political economy, with institutions being relatively high, politicians doing less well, and private business and corporate interests perhaps doing the worst. So to start off with, Nika, I thought I'd begin with you. So Nika was, as you would all know, elected first of all as a minister in Georgia in 2004, and then eventually became Prime Minister in 2009 to 2012. You stepped into a situation where presumably the people of Georgia had similar views, perhaps worse views, about the political economy of their nation, about the politicians, their institutions, and their bind with corporate interests. And yet today, Georgia is heralded as perhaps the biggest success story in battling corruption and driving up integrity within the nation. How did you do it?
Thank you for the question. And when we are asking these type of questions, the answer is depends. Depends in which kind of situation, depends in which country, depends on the circumstances. Why I believe that politicians as well as institutions can be trustworthy, because I've seen that happening in my country. And just to give you the kind of scale of transformation, I'll just give some figures. In 2003, before the reforms, Georgia was regarded as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. According to Transparency International, in 2003, Georgia was named on 127th place out of 133 countries that were reviewed that year. So we were bottom of the bottom, and thank God, like Nigeria and Tajikistan existed, that otherwise Georgia was the champion of the corruption in 2003. If there was a championship, we would be in finals, definitely. I mean, maybe losing in semifinals, but. And that was in 2003. Only 6 years later, also according to Transparency International, Georgia was one of the least corrupt countries in the world. And in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, Transparency International did the review saying that have you or member of your family paid bribe in the past 12 months? Only 4% of Georgia said yes. It was much better result than EU average or United States. Only countries that did better than us were like 15 or 20 countries, Nordic countries, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, these type of countries. So, I mean, within very, very short period of time, countries saw amazing results of fighting corruption. What is even more interesting, also Transparency International did a survey, do you trust corruption will increase or decrease during the next 3 years? In 2005, more than 69% said they trust it will increase. Only 1 year later, it was 11%. So population can feel this transformation, the effort of the government within very, very short period of time. It doesn't take long. It actually, the results can be visible in very short period of time if this effort is genuine. It's not only political will. By the way, I've met so many government members around the world. All of them have political will to fight corruption. I still yet to find a person in a government, in any government, who doesn't have a political will to fight corruption. The main question is it genuine? And do they know how to do that? Is there a team behind this? And when you ask a question, how did you do that? It's a very difficult question. I don't think there is a very specific answer. Based on Georgian experience, I can tell you there is a kind of 3-stage formula which puts together our efforts. First of all, and number one is you need to have preconditions in a country to fight corruption successfully. And preconditions are you need a capable team, you need a clean leader, and you need a population who is really, really fed up with corruption. And in Georgia in 2003, we had these conditions. The population was really, really fed up with corruption, and they said that, guys, do whatever you want, just get rid of corruption. And that gave us a very good kind of credit to do this type of reforms. And if you look at from now at the history, you will see that there were main 3 pillars based on which I believe we were successful of fighting corruption. One was simplification of rules and regulations. Small countries, developing countries, poor countries cannot afford complex rules and regulations that EU sometimes is offering or sometimes is pushing developing countries to have. It's impossible because small and developing countries do not have human resources or financial resources to do and co-op with this type of rules and regulations. That was one. Second, I still believe is that you cannot expect your civil servants not to take bribes if they have a moral cause to take bribes. By this I mean that if your civil servant has $10 per month salary, which was the case, by the way, in Georgia in 2003, everybody expects him or her to take bribe. And when he looks at himself in the morning, he says that if I don't take a bribe, my family is going to die of starvation. So and the whole society has this kind of consensus that, yes, this guy has to take a bribe. So you need to take away this moral argument. And your civil servants had to be paid at a decent level. And by decent level, I don't mean that they have to become millionaires, but at the level of their vis-a-vis in private sector. And third, which I also think is very, very important, is what I call carrot and stick approach. And in public sector, we actually adopted private sector experience, saying that to the best performers, we'll give official bribes, which is bonuses. We'll give bonuses, and to worst performers, they will actually leave the job. And it's very rare when in public sector you can actually fire people, but we had to adopt this approach. And I believe that this kind of 3-step approach was a key for fighting corruption in Georgia, where public servants have decided actually to to move ahead with innovation, with better services, with citizen-centric policies, and providing better service to the public and to the private sector.
Thanks, Nika. Andrew, if I could turn to you. So you today work for a consulting firm upon which governments call on during crises, and they have a crisis of trust at the moment. So what solutions can you offer to them in terms of rebuilding trust? What would you suggest?
It's a good question. So we spend a lot of time working with the government on what I would call kind of citizen satisfaction. And I think one of the things a lot of our researchers found, which is quite interesting, is that there's a real connection between the idea of citizen satisfaction and the idea of trust. Now, I kind of agree that there very much is, I think, particularly in developed economies, a kind of a crisis of trust in government. And so you talked about the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is pretty commonly cited, but also kind of Gallup in the US asked people kind of what's your kind of greatest concern, and the kind of most significant concern of the people in their sample was dissatisfaction with the government. And so we look both at kind of high levels of dissatisfaction with government, but also very low levels of trust in government, and try and understand what are some of the kind of links between those two things. So we've done some survey work that looks at about kind of a sample size of about 15,000 in the US, so fairly kind of significant. And what that shows is quite interesting. It shows that people who are satisfied with their lived experience of interaction with government are much more likely to trust the government to do the right thing than people who aren't satisfied with that interaction. And what's quite interesting, if you look at the Edelman data, is at least for the 2017-2018 surveys, some of the institutions that are trusted the most are actually technology companies, which might seem somewhat counterintuitive, given some of the kind of press coverage over the course of the last year or so. And I think the theory behind what's going on here is the technology companies have really provided most people with an experience that leaves them very satisfied. And they've actually raised the bar for governments around the world in terms of how they interact with their citizens. That's in terms of things like product, so the kind of product that you experience. It's in terms of things like the kind of quality of service. What's your quality of service experience if you're interacting with Netflix versus if you're interacting with most state entities in kind of developed countries? There's often a large kind of gulf there. The UK has made some pretty significant steps forward in the way that we do that in welfare, for example, and what does kind of the customer experience look like. And so a lot of the kind of work that we actually focus on with our clients in developed markets is what does it take to really move the needle in terms of the product that you offer to the citizen, in terms of the experience that you give them, in terms of the kind of quality of service along the way. And that might seem kind of technocratic or kind of nitty-gritty in the process when we're kind of talking about large kind of macro and kind of political issues. But I think actually for most developed countries, it's that interaction between your lived experience of kind of living with the government on a day-to-day basis, which is 90% of your kind of experience of government, and the kind of degree to which you trust them. And that's really the thing that I think we've been kind of largely in developed markets kind of advising governments on and trying to help them rebuild a level of satisfaction and trust. And I'm kind of intrigued to see what the 2019 Edelman data kind of says, and if that kind of continues to kind of reinforce some of that narrative or not.
Thanks, Andrew. So, I mean, I'm a philosopher, and I always find it interesting that we have a lot of these discussions at a public level about what to do about trust, and very, very rarely is the answer, well, people should be more trustworthy. And I wonder whether sometimes in discourses about trust, we wonder very much about, well, how can we change people's perceptions of what we're doing without necessarily changing what we're doing? And I was going to turn to you, Karen, and I wonder whether, do you think that we can actually make people and leaders more trustworthy and actually people of integrity? And what does that require? Does that require some actual moral fluency, some ability to think as a moral leader? And if so, how can you train that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'm going to come from this with the perspective of an educator. And my purview is really based in the United States in the work that I've done as a dean, both at Princeton and at Harvard Kennedy School. But I'm going to give you some context as to why I decided to pursue that route, to make sure we're educating leaders who have a moral compass and then allow themselves to be empowered in ways that influence not only the people who report to them, but the governmental structure or their organization. And it started actually with my training as a historian and seeing that over time, and I would kind of do this as an exercise with each of you, think about the different institutions that you represent, or think about different institutions that you want to see change with. What's their history? What's their legacy as it relates to integrity? Is there a sense of there being integrity built into the ethos of the institution or not? And just from the questions that you asked earlier, we see there's a pervasive history and sentiment that we don't have the type of integrity that we want to see with our leaders. My training as a historian helped me to understand and appreciate how different groups have been disenfranchised in the United States, whether it was women not having the right to vote until very late in the process in the early part of the 1900s. And so you talk about liberty, freedom, justice, democracy, but you have over half of the population not represented, right? So the institution of government itself. And then you have other groups that are disenfranchised throughout the civil rights movement. People of color are asked to take poll taxes or pay poll taxes or to take certain tests to see if they know the Constitution. And it's not applied equally. So you have a history of distrusting the government because the very process to allow engagement is flawed. So think about the history, and because of that study and because of that context of me learning about institutions and the history and the legacy, it led me to government actually to want to have an impact in terms of change. And I work with 3 different governmental administrations in the state of New Jersey. And New Jersey and Illinois in the United States are 2 very different and unique models because the governor has a lot of authority. They're allowed to kind of establish their own cabinets within the state, and that allows them to have access to the federal government on a national level. And those are 2 state governmental structures that exist out of the entire United States that have that type of autonomy. And to be honest with you, I was frustrated with what I saw in terms of entry-level workers, middle managers, and senior executives, and this question and issue of morality and ethics being infused into the work that we did. And so my thought was, well, I'll go to the academy. If I go to the academy, then I can, as a dean, be able to shape the curriculum and help us to really be able to teach students who want to go and make a change in government or in public organizations or even the private sector and think about what they need to do to make an impact in terms of being moral leaders. The challenge is oftentimes, and I've done this for about a decade now, working with students and then helping them to kind of transition into entry-level positions, or in many cases at the Kennedy School, we have mid-career students who would come in from government. They would be immersed in the environment, academic environment, and then go back into governmental service. And they really were challenged with this issue of integrity because they inherited corruption. They inherited a number of challenges that came with their roles, and they were there to figure out what are the strategies, what are the approaches that I need to be successful in my role, while also making sure I'm highlighting the public importance of public integrity and being a leader that really demonstrates that I'm committed to the citizenry and I have a moral compass that I'm not going to compromise on. I think oftentimes there's this public perception, are we doing campaigns? Are we providing communication and strategies that educate the public about ways that we're trying to be ethical and moral? I think there's a lot of work that we need to do there. But I think as an academic and as a dean, making sure that our students had kind of the deliberate approach in thinking as they went into their respective roles, that a key component was making sure that they were moral, that they did their work with a sense of integrity, and that they understood kind of the complexity that came along with that. And so it's not easy, I'll be honest, because there's some systems and some structures that are corrupt. And so I think for a young person coming from a master's program or a doctoral program, getting into that environment, they not only want to know and understand how do I do this work and have my own personal and professional values, but how do I then influence others? How do I make a change and an impact in a way that makes them question what they're doing and ultimately strive to make an impact that is best for the citizenry?
Thank you. So Ben, you were a member of Parliament for 7 years, and I think in your last year you were Minister for the Cabinet Office, and in that role, effectively, was the minister in charge of the public service as a whole, and as it were, then in charge of responsible for the integrity of the civil service. Within the United Kingdom. What do you think were the hardest, the biggest risks to the integrity of the civil service within the United Kingdom? From that vantage point, what could you see were the greatest pressures upon that ethical culture?
I think we're phenomenally lucky, actually, in this country that you asked questions earlier about trust in institutions, and we can speak separately about people's trust in politicians, which is a very, very complex area, and one which I think people themselves don't understand the subtleties which they're able to be both distrustful and trustful of individuals. But separate from that, actually, we still maintain a very high level of trust in institutions, and you can see that from the polling data. Now, the civil service doesn't enjoy the same level of trust that it did, but it hasn't slipped hugely, and the judiciary still has a very high level of trust. They are civil servants, as does the army and the royal family. So the kind of core constitutional institutions which sit at the foundation of our nation still command the trust of the majority of people. I think the thing that most threatens it is the manner in which we continue public discourse, and this is, I think, a problem that across nations around the world we're seeing increasingly. Is that if you change the way that people feel that they can speak and make accusation and behave, then you poison the well of that. Of that kind of commonly held sense of integrity about public institutions. And that's why the way that politicians especially, but also people in the media, and increasingly those people who hold sway online, deport themselves is absolutely critical to maintaining trust in common institutions. So, to take a kind of live example, the way that some people for political ends have attacked the judiciary in Britain for the first time, really serious attacks. Similarly, the way that people shamefully in the Conservative Party have attacked civil servants purely for their own political reasons is a profoundly damaging thing to start to do, because what you're actually doing is kind of sawing away at the legs of these important institutions which keep us free and keep us, by extension, corruption-free. So I think, actually, we've got to do something quite big around rediscovering something we were discussing, actually, last night, around the language that we use in terms of public discourse. Now, my own view is that we have a philosophical language which has become overly dominated by language of human rights. And that means that we have stopped talking about civic virtues, especially service and integrity, which have to lie right at the centre of what politicians and civil servants, and indeed people in the press, do. So that's a kind of a philosophical approach. I think there's a very practical issue that we have, which is that for the whole of human history, the nutcase in the village annoyed his or her neighbours and no one else. And now, for the first time, the nutcase is able to annoy everyone. And or get elected, maybe. Yeah. Ultimately, well, there's now a ladder. Now, obviously, the wonders of social media and the internet have created extraordinary opportunities for people fighting for freedom, being able to have their voices heard in a way that they have not been for a very long time. But we really have to be serious about the flip side of that, which is that you are able now, we are able to have a coarseness and an unbalanced public debate, which makes it hard to be able to discuss things in a way which assumes integrity in your interlocutor. And that is really corrosive to public trust.
I mean, in 2012, you suggested an idea which was to have, on the back of everyone's tax report of each year, a breakdown on where their taxes had gone. So if anyone has paid tax in the UK, as opposed to maybe the Cayman Islands in this room, that's why you're here, to learn about integrity. You get a breakdown of where your tax would have proportionally gone. So if 10% had gone here or 20% had gone here, defence budget, the European Union, etc. And so the rationale that you'd put forward was, well, this would help our discourse understand where public money was being spent, and particularly push back on the idea that it was being perhaps overspent, or majority was being spent on the European Union, defence spending, Trident, or overseas aid. Yet, do you think so that was implemented, do you think that actually made it? That sounds like a very mature solution to the fake news world. It seems like a very clever solution. Yeah, but do you think it actually made a difference? Or do you think we've just moved to a point where government is helpless to throw facts back in people's faces?
Well, you are right that one of the things that I said when I introduced the bill, and it then did happen, was I thought it would make people kind of alive to the very small amounts of money we contributed to the European Union. Well, look what happened there. So it clearly didn't have the effect that I intended on that. Although public concern with aid spending is not as acute as it was 3 years ago. Now, I can't put that down to tax statements, but I think it's all to the good if people have transparency. But we have to be realistic also about the cost of transparency, which is that in being transparent, especially about interests, people assume that because you've declared an interest, you have therefore an interest which is in some way compromising. And the kind of declaration of interest culture, which is necessary and important, has had a corollary effect, which is that lots of people will not now go into public service because one of the conditions, especially at senior level, is that you have to declare interests, which immediately get picked up as evidence of all these kind of corrupt networking relationships which you might or might not be pursuing. And that's a tricky thing. And we just have to be accepting of the fact that it has a penalty in terms of the numbers of people who want to come forward and serve, especially on a part-time basis.
Nika, so you gave us a bit of a flavour of the successful strategies that your government put into place. But you also mentioned to me today this great idea that Georgia became a laboratory for corruption and integrity reform, and that for every successful policy, there were lots of mistakes. I was wondering whether you could illustrate to us some of those mistakes, things that you thought, that's genius, that's going to work, that's going to make a difference, and then for some reason it didn't work, and then how you managed that process and what insights you got, general insights.
So like that. Practical example of that.
Absolutely.
Okay. One of the, I think, very interesting reforms that we managed was actually school financing reform, which is kind of, in most of the developed countries, I believe that this reform is done where money follows student, and which gives schools kind of motivation to compete against each other. So more students they receive, more payments they will get. What is very important that the student can go to the private school and the money will follow the student, budgetary funds will follow the student to the private school as well, which gave us higher number of very good private schools as well. Plus we provided some additional incentives for teachers to pass additional exams of knowing English language, knowing their own topics and so on and so on. And we gave some additional bonuses based on that. At some level, we decided that all teachers have to pass some exams, which is, and because we realized that number of teachers were a bit too high from past history, and we decided that these teachers have 1 year to pass an exam, and if they don't pass the exams, they will not be able to teach, which we thought was a logical kind of statement. Apparently, every teacher came out in the streets and said that it's total kind of very, very bad idea because they have been teaching students for so many years, and according to the one particular exam, they cannot be judged. And this whole idea of the whole reform based on kind of built-up reform of stage by stage, of year by year, everything was going down the drains because of this small mistake. And then we realized that we have to reform the reform. We said we had to announce that, okay, teachers have 18 months to do that, and they can pass it 3 times. If all 3 times you don't pass the exam, then you don't get the certificate until you do it one more time within next 2 to 3 years' time. So what I'm trying to say is that once you start reforming, it's impossible for the reform to be 100% bulletproof. It's impossible for the reform to be 100% accurate and amazing. It will definitely have flaws. It's just that government has to be not afraid to say that we will be coming back to this reform later this year or later next year. We will be reforming the reform, because it doesn't matter how much time you spend planning on the reform, you will never get it 100% right. Because in practice, some things go wrong. In practice, some political realities or some economic realities, some social realities go not as they planned. So I believe that reforms are never one-off process. Reforms is kind of a process where you once start, you cannot stop. And when it's like riding a bicycle. You stop, you fall down. Once you stop, you really slow down, and you cannot and you should not be afraid of reforming the reforms.
So how do you manage the expectations of an impatient public?
That's the most important question. Now we get there. I believe that success of any government is based on managing expectations. Managing expectations of the public. That's the virtue of success story of any government. I believe that our government in the very beginning was very good in managing expectations, and it deteriorated in the later years, and in the end lost elections. But the main idea was, and I believe it still is, telling to the public what is wrong with the current system, explaining what you want to do with it, and giving them expectation of the time frame when they will see results. Unfortunately, this last part is the most difficult part, identifying the time frame and delivering the results. But unless you manage the expectations of the public properly, there is no way you can be successful in any reform or reforming the reforms. So when you announce a reform, you have to add to that, by the way, I'll be coming back to that within 6 to 9 months' time. I'm sure there will be some flaws, and let us fix that then. And many governments, and by the way, my company and myself personally, we are advising like up to 25 governments now in the wider region. Most of the governments are afraid to do that. Most of the governments are afraid to announce that they may be mistaken. Right now, they want to seem so sure that their reforms will be positive. They want to get so much political support behind these reforms that they are not willing to admit that there is a small chance of us being wrong, and there is a chance of us needing to go back to the reform. And this is where problems happened. Because 9 months down the road, they are already scared to admit that there is something needs to be fixed. And until this problem becomes bigger, and then until this problem starts eating up budget of the country, and when something really needs to be done. The whole idea is that let's fix it until it becomes big problem.
Thanks, Nika. So I think we might open it up now to the audience. Have we got any questions from the audience? Yes. Do we have a microphone? Thanks, Joe. So perhaps just down here.
Thanks. My name is Megan Cox. I'm from the Oregon State Police in the U.S. And you can feel free to dispute this premise, but I think anyone who's worked in government has come in and felt like they're really going to do great and they're really going to be ethical and follow the rules. And if they haven't experienced this, they've seen someone kind of stop feeling that way. Is there a way that you've experienced kind of an ethical burnout in public service? And is there a way you can think of to kind of counter that or mitigate that?
Perhaps Karen.
Are we going to take the questions or respond now?
Well, why don't we take 3, and then so maybe have you think about that one. Perhaps yes, in the middle.
Thanks for being here. My name is Camilla Vogt. I'm a student at the Blavatnik School of Government. So on the US campaign trail, politicians often refer to Washington and the associated political apparatus in very disparaging terms, and it works. And so the practical implication is sort of a general erosion of public faith in government and public institutions. So how do we shift the narrative towards one of integrity and public service, as was discussed earlier, when the opposite is serving a short-term political purpose? I think you can make all the reforms in the world, but if the public doesn't buy it, then it won't really go very far.
So just to clarify, it's about how we shift our expectations of our politicians to integrity?
I think it's electorally expedient for elected officials to talk about public servants in disparaging terms right now in the US. And so how do you make a change towards integrity and speaking about public servants in those terms when it serves a purpose not to?
Great, thank you very much. So just up the back.
Thank you. My name is Mehdi Iskariye, and I'm research director at the Harvard campus. My question is to Karen. With the manner of the public discourse that we are seeing in the United States now, and the way that the head of an administration is exercising nepotism, perhaps his last night, the release of his video, what lasting effect is actually is having on what was perhaps believed to be a robust public integrity and public service in the United States? Will it be transitory, or will it be rather permanent?
Great, thank you very much. So perhaps Karen, I'll get you on that one, and Ben, perhaps maybe you might discuss the dynamics of disparaging of public servants within discourse, maybe within Brexit, and then perhaps Andrew or Nika on burnout and compromise. Is it Karen?
I'll jump in and I'll try to address briefly the others, and would love for my colleagues to chime in. But the question of ethical burnout is pervasive, as you know, because the culture doesn't really lend itself to you being ethical oftentimes, and it's unfortunate, but you know that's the reality of it. And as I expressed earlier, I was in state government in New Jersey, and I think that's what I experienced. And it wasn't because I wasn't being ethical, it was because I saw people who didn't really reflect the values that they said they did. So it was kind of, this rhetoric. And I think what the Prime Minister said this morning is really critical. And during the era that I worked in state government, it was this sense of, well, I'm in public service to be served. And those were the people that were in leadership at that time in many ways. And so it wasn't this notion and this consciousness of wanting to serve others. And so I come in with my other colleagues, that kind of idealist saying, we're going to change, we're going to make an impact. And the issue of leadership, kind of supporting and making sure the culture, the organizational culture, supports that type of ethical approaches and the sense of integrity, that's critical. And I think if you don't have the leadership to shape the organizational culture, it can lead to ethical burnout. But I think that you have to be vigilant. So even once I left, I still stayed involved in different committees because my role was different. I could hold them to certain standards, and I could have them be accountable in different ways, but I wasn't an employee. I was outside of the government. But I do think the point that you're raising about the challenges that come with it, we were actually talking about this at dinner last night. One of my colleagues said, I can do what I do, and I can kind of push the needle in terms of really seeing how important it is to be ethical and to have a sense of integrity. She said, but in some ways you have to hide. You can't let people know that you're very outspoken and very committed in that way. And so it is a challenge, but I think that, my answer to you would be, we can't allow burnout to dissuade us. And I think the other piece is leadership is really key. And we talked earlier before the panel about how do you institute professional development and training in ways within our organizations and within our institutions that promote and cultivate integrity, and that really emphasize the importance of ethics. And in the same way that you have a performance evaluation on your job or your responsibilities, how is ethics infused in that? So it's a metric, right? And so I would say maybe that's something we need to be more deliberate about. And I think there's a whole nother conversation, I hope my colleagues will jump in terms of the US and the question about how it's being turned around in ways that are really not kind of engaging people to hold officials to being ethical and to have a sense of integrity, but it's really kind of being used in a way that turns public service and what it means to be a person of integrity on its head. It's actually countercultural, right? But others can please chime in for other contexts, because that's more so the American context, not that it's not the case in other places.
But I think this is the great, you've asked one of the great questions of the age, this very short-lived experiment that we're living through called mass participatory democracy. It's young, and it's only 90 years ago this year that women got the vote on equal terms in this country. So if you take that as your year zero, we've not been at this for very long. And almost all of that experience has been framed by a cataclysmic disruption in civilized states in Europe, and the result of that. And if you were conscious of that at one or two removes, and you knew that what you were doing was different from a kind of rabid, screaming Goebbels leaning over a lectern and using language which no sensible human being would use, then you would understand the importance and the genuine import of moderation in language. And I'm afraid that we're kind of reaching a half-life at that point. I think that's partly because cultural memory is removed, so we've kind of forgotten what happens when you ramp up language. It's partly the result of irresponsibility in the media, as well as by some politicians, but they are both to blame for it. And it's partly also because of this kind of fervid atmosphere that is created by social media discussion of so much that that we're trying to do as nations. No, how do you counter that? Well, I don't have a silver bullet, because in the end it will only happen by people feeling that civic virtues, one of which is moderation and care in how you speak, is important. And that can only happen from leadership. So the only way we're really going to fix it is by the happy day when we have a leader in the United States who wins precisely because he's able or she is able to demonstrate that moderation in speaking is part of their appeal, which the previous president did to great effect.
And that was the question you were asking, right? This question of, you were asking that, sir, right? And I think you're absolutely right,
Just to kind of finish that point, because I want to reflect what Karen said, because I so agree with what she said, that it has to come from leadership. But it also has to be an argument about effectiveness, because you know perfectly well, so many people in this room who work in public service, the demoralizing effect of being attacked. I mean, I felt it personally as a politician, but I don't really care because I had a kind of thick skin. But if you go into public service, especially as a civil servant, where you're not going in for a public profile, and you can't answer back when people attack you. If you see the attacks that you're getting every day from politicians, from the media, for being incompetent or useless or mendacious or whatever, and that's the same here as it is in the United States, as in so many places, it has a very deleterious effect on your performance. And the result is that you get worse results out of the people who are here to serve. And that means there is a real duty on the leaders of civil services, of administrations who are non-political, to stand up for their people. It was very good that the wonderful last cabinet secretary and his successor have both been very strong in this country. And I know it's harder because of the setup in the United States for the leaders of the civil service to do that. But it is incumbent on all of us and those people in positions of authority in bureaucracies to stand up for the civic virtues that keep those institutions safe. And part of that is by insisting on moderate language.
If I may jump in, I definitely cannot comment, and I wouldn't comment about the US, but I just want to give a couple of examples of us reforming public services. Because when we decide to reform the public services and do something new there, we realized that we were facing two problems. One, public servants were decision makers, but they were risk-averse people. If they were risk takers, they would go to entrepreneurship. But in general, public service men are public service women are risk-averse people. They don't like innovations. They don't like new things. Unless they are giving some specific formulas based on which they're motivated to innovate, or they realize that they can get fired because this complacency and being comfortable of not being able to get fired, which we've seen in many, many countries, does bring problems to the public service. And creating this environment for public servants that either you innovate, you come up something new, and if you come up with something new, you get bonuses, you get promotion. And there are four things that really motivates public servants. This is financial bonus, this is public exposure, TV exposure, whatever it is, promotion, and international exposure, like participating in these type of things. So for every public servant, you need to find kind of combination of these four in order for them to be motivated to do something new, to innovate. Otherwise, it will not stay. It will stay as it is for a very, very long period of time. And second, what we realize that public servants are not best service people. They are decision makers. They decide if you get a permit or not. Recruited service-oriented people, and we could. Action was there in the public service hall. Actual decisions are made by public servants, but interaction of asking for a passport or asking for register your land, register a contract, register marriage, register that, you name it. Up to 500 different services are provided in public service hall, where totally different type of people employed, service-oriented people, from private banking, from just newly graduated university student, people like that. They just provide services. Actual decisions are made in the back office. And this actually was one of the most popular reforms that we did in Georgia, where we created one amazing kind of front office of the whole government services, which many, many governments have tried to copy since then, but not many have been successful.
I love the idea of calling this service the public service whole.
Yep.
As if things just disappear, but things actually come back out. All right. So further questions? Yes, yes, sir. 1, 2, and just up the back. Thanks.
Thank you. Serge Mikhailov from IRIS in Paris. Well, in previous life, working for the World Bank or the French aid system, I happened to work in some of the most corrupt countries. And what strikes me from my experience was corruption was not an individual problem or an ethical problem. It was very much embedded into the political economy. Basically, and particularly in multi-ethnic or multi-religious countries, the system in power needed to accumulate a number of rents to support its authority and to buy support also from. And basically, there was an allocation of different state institutions to powerful cronies whose main objective was to extract rent from these institutions. So the objective was not to provide a railway service, airplane service, electricity, water, etc. It was to extract as much as possible of rent and to channel it to the party. The corrupt person is the one who was taking too much for his own pocket. So my question is very much to Nika. Basically, was Georgia in this type of situation or not? Was it a problem? Because in this type of situation, unless you have a complete change in the overall political economy, a change of regime, not of government, a change of regime, and with a new team, etc., you frankly cannot expect much progress.
Great, thank you very much. We'll grab through.
Thank you very much. Really just comment in the School of Government, Dr. Hood, Professor Hoods and Kirby. Excellent program. My question really is about, I want to put a question to the panel. My question really is about the role of professionals in reforming the public service. And I just want to take up the point that it's not just the loss of trust in politicians, neither the loss of trust of public institutions, but we're seeing a new phenomena while I'm from South Africa, where there's a loss in the integrity and the roles of professionals. And here I want to just particularly raise the point and raise a question, which is we've seen various professional firms in South Africa being attacked and criticized by government and the public in colluding with unsavory practices. Now, there's no truth out yet who's guilty or not, so I'm not saying anybody's guilty, but there's a public perception that audit firms, consulting firms, and even communication firms have colluded with state capture culture. And obviously, in short-termism, as opposed to kind of really critically looking at assignments and whether those that professional firms, or what can professional firms do to make sure that they don't fall foul to that kind of criticism? Because there's no way we can transform the public sector without the roles of professionals.
Great. Thank you very much. And just the last up the back there. So, thanks a lot, Joe. Cheers.
Hi, Jonathan Chang from the Commonwealth Secretariat. Just had a question in terms of countries or situations where perhaps the organizational culture leadership is not conducive to having discussions around public integrity. And quite a simple question, how would you advise civil servants in those environments to develop, maintain their own public integrity, or try to assist a conversation in those settings where often the stakes are very high? So you can imagine ministries of tax, anti-corruption commissions, where they're not really supported by the institution to have those kind of conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I might turn to you for that one. Nick, would you like to kick off?
Yes, I will start with the first question. You're absolutely right. There was actually change of power, significant change of power in 2003, end of 2003, where all the regime went away and Rose Revolution, a new government came. But Georgia proved that corruption is neither cultural, nor historic, nor innate, nor people-driven, nor private sector wants to do that. Georgian experience showed that it can be fought successfully in a short period of time. It needs just drastic changes. Couple of examples. And by the way, don't try this at home. For example, we had a terrible, terrible traffic police. I mean, probably one of the worst traffic police, most corrupt institutions in the world. I mean, these people were actually not given any salaries. They were giving a stick and said that go earn your money. We fired every single traffic policeman in one day. All of them.
What was the response to that?
Happy. Population was absolutely. What is more important? Traffic was better. Without traffic policemen, traffic was better. I personally, when I became Minister of Energy, had to fire more than 3,000 middle-class to high-class managers of energy sector. And I was blamed that I'm a person, unprofessional, who has no idea what he's doing, firing all the professionals and bringing all the young, stupid, inexperienced people, not knowing what to do. But these all reforms proved to be very, very successful. So there is no cultural corruption. There is no innate, historical, something like that corruption. It can be fought very easily. And one more very, very important thing, companies, especially private sector, do not like to pay bribes. They love, and Georgian experience shows this, they love to pay taxes fully. They want to be clean. They want to be able to get access to the banking credits or international credits or international partners and so on and so on. And when they are in shadow economy, they are not being used to the fully, these opportunities. So if the regulations, if the taxes are normal, if approach is simple, And if bureaucracy is clean, the private sector is also clean. But it definitely needs this type of very drastic approach to fight corruption.
Andrew? Sure. So it's a great question. So a few reflections. So I think the first is, I genuinely believe that one of certainly McKinsey's kind of missions and kind of our sets of values is about making a positive impact and a positive difference to the world. I genuinely believe that. It's the reason I joined the firm a decade ago. It's the reason I'm still here, and I've yet to find any of my kind of partner colleagues who don't believe that as a kind of statement of our values. I think the second thing is if you want to make a difference in the world, you broadly have to serve institutions that matter. And that involves serving national governments around the world, as well as Fortune 500 companies, leading social sector organizations. They are many of the organizations that really matter in the world and that truly make a difference in people's lives. Countries like South Africa, Saudi Arabia has been in the news kind of recently. They're countries of tens of millions of people, and the lives of the kind of citizens in those countries kind of really meaningfully matter. But working around the world and kind of serving institutions that matter come with some risks. Probably three reflections on your specific question, which is kind of what is to be learned for professional firms. I think McKinsey has learned some lessons from our experience in South Africa, but potentially kind of three kind of thoughts there. I think one is, you need to be very, you need to have a rigorous process for thinking about client selection. And that's something that we kind of have at McKinsey and something that we've really reflected on kind of after our experience in South Africa. I know some other professional firms have as well. But client selection and kind of who you serve, not just at a country level, but also kind of within countries, can be kind of very important. I think the second thing is you need to take a pretty rigorous approach to due diligence. And I think for us, that has meant a rigorous approach to due diligence around for example, consulting intermediaries or kind of partners that we work with. And I think that's something that's taken on for most professional firms a kind of real prominence. And I think the kind of final piece I think is that you have to broadly kind of think about what the kind of risk of in some of these situations is. But I guess this is a topic that's important to me. I spent 3 years of my life serving the Saudi Arabian government on education reform. And I'm very proud of the work that we did there. We increased access for women in vocational education. We significantly improved the quality of vocational education in the country. And so I think it's a difficult question for most professional firms. And it's a personal view, but I don't think the answer is to kind of shy away from serving institutions that matter. But there are clearly some lessons to learn about how you can serve institutions in some of the countries that have been in the news. But I think it's a great question. I think it's something that, frankly, McKinsey is a partnership, and I know a lot of other professional firms are thinking pretty actively about how you kind of engage.
Thank you, Andrew. And perhaps someone on what do public servants do? How can civil servants perhaps address issues of integrity when the political atmosphere is not so easily receptive to such conversations?
I think that's a whole panel in itself, right? I know we're running short on time. I would love to talk to you afterwards, but I do think that there's some real challenges that come along with it. It's almost akin to putting your head in the lion's mouth, right? You have to do so carefully and judiciously. And I think that depending on your context, your strategy and approach has to be well thought out. And I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all way of thinking about how to solve the problem. I do think, however, that even in those instances, you have a lot more agency than you believe that you do, or the individual thinks that they do. And I think one way, and I'll just share one quick example, I think there are ways of getting the public to hold you accountable. So, using your platform and using ways to highlight the work that you do, and finding champions and allies who can partner with you in holding the organization or the institution accountable, so that the pressure really isn't just on you per se, but you're really kind of galvanizing and connecting with others who share that perspective. But there's a strategy that goes along with it and careful thought. and approaches that are necessary depending on the context, because there are political issues that come along with that. There are cultural pieces that are attached to that. And honestly, I think we could probably spend a whole nother hour chatting about that. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, that's why this, the meetings like this are so important, and this, the work that this school does is so important, because the effect of diffusion in terms of the values of people who attend here and part of the Blavatnik family are critical to trying to engender the kind of resilience which we're talking about in institutions around the world. And that will only come from an internalized understanding of public service. By that I mean not the idea that because you are a public servant, you therefore are in service, because that way entitlement comes. It's actually, for every single public servant, understanding that when they go to work every day, they are there to serve the public. And if you can internalize that, then you can find the courage to be able to stand up to those, hopefully, who will try and undermine that work, and also the integrity to be able to ensure that those around you are fulfilling that same vocation. Because in the end, most public servants, and I find this where I work around the world, it's quite hard to find public servants who don't turn up to work every day. Clearly there are many who don't, but generally they turn up to work every day because they really have a vocation to help. And it's often the systems that try and get in the way of that. So you get this burnout that was referred to earlier. So with a real sense of public service, you will find the leadership to be able to show moral leadership, moral integrity, and the courage that's required to say no when things are asked of you which were inappropriate. And in doing that, we might be able to see our way through these rather interesting times.
Thanks, Ben. I just have, our time is up, but I just have one question for all of you here on the panel, which is in a couple of words or in a sentence. What do you think integrity means?
Yeah, that's good.
That's another panel. Please.
Karen?
I'll jump in. Never compromise your personal values for professional gain. Never compromise your personal values for professional gain. And so that really ties into what you were saying. There's no job that's worth putting at risk what you believe in terms of your values and being committed to public service and what it means in terms of being an individual who supports integrity. Sorry.
One sentence. Or even just a couple of words.
Loyalty?
Loyalty.
I would actually think that loyalty would be...
Loyalty to the institution.
Loyalty to the institution, yeah, to the public service, loyalty to what you are doing and believing in what you are doing. I think that believing, owning yourself this job, I think it's very important, that loyalty.
Andrew?
Doing the right thing, no matter how challenging that might be.
Service to others.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for